Welcome, everyone. We'll begin in a few minutes. So welcome, everyone. I'll go ahead and get started. More people may be joining in the first few minutes. I'll introduce myself. My name is Julia Isaacs, and I'm so pleased to welcome you to our third webinar in the series, Building Your Capacity as a CCDF Lead Agency to Use Data in Policy Decisions. Today, our topic is Answering More Childcare Policy Questions, Pairing Stakeholder Perspectives with Your Data. In the next slide, I provide a brief overview of today's webinar. We are beginning with welcome and introductions. Second, Gina Adams, my colleague here at the Urban Institute, will introduce our topic. She'll talk about stakeholder perspectives, answering the questions why, who, and how. Third, we will hear some recent experiences that researchers have had in gathering information from stakeholders, and we'll be hearing from Julia Henley from the University of Chicago and Teresa Derrick Mills from the Urban Institute. Fourth, we'll be hearing reactions from a state agency perspective. Linda Satterfield, the Illinois Office of Child Care, will provide those. And fifth, last but not least, we will hear from your questions and reflections. But please do not wait for the end for your questions. You can submit questions and chat at any point during the webinar using our chat box, as explained by our project manager, Eleanor Lauterbach, in the next slide.
Thanks, Julia. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. I'll quickly go through some logistics. First of all, the webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be posted online a few months after the webinar. We have a large group today. Let me see how many. About 57 people on the line at this point, so everyone will be muted throughout the conversation. If you would like to share questions or comments, please type them into the chat box. I've included a screenshot of the Zoom panel in the slide, highlighting where the chat is located in blue. We encourage you to send your questions, as it will help make the webinar more interactive. We also would like to know more about who is listening in today, so I will open up a poll and ask you to tell us which of the following groups you fall into.
So I hope you can see a poll on your screen. And we are giving you 5 choices. Are you CCDF Lead Agency staff from any part of the agency? Are you technical assistance providers? Are you federal staff from any federal agency? Are you external researchers? That is, researchers who are not inside the CCDF agency. And are you others with a role I have not yet mentioned? Just type on the screen, and I'll wait a minute until Eleanor closes the poll and pulls up the results. Okay, the poll results show that 29% of you are CCDF Lead Agency staff. Also, 29% of you are TA providers. We have 5% federal staff, and our largest group is actually slightly larger, but about the same as lead agency staff and TA providers. 32% are external researchers, and 5% are other. So whatever group you fall into, it's great to have you on this webinar. In the next slide, I'll briefly introduce the center staff whose voices you're hearing. So I'm Julia Isaacs, the director of the Center for Supporting Research on CCDBG Implementation. We've also just heard from Eleanor Lauterbach, the project manager. As we show in the next slide, the Center for Supporting Research on CCDBG Implementation is supported through the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation, OPRE, in the Administration for Children and Families, and is managed through a contract with the Urban Institute. Let me give a shout out to Meryl Borofsky and Alicia Blandon, who've provided great support for this webinar series in their role as OPRE project officers. Our goal here at the center is to support CCDF lead agencies in building research and evaluation capacity. We do this through a series of activities, including this webinar series. We have some written resources, and we support CCDF lead agencies who are grantees, particularly those who have CCDBG implementation research and evaluation planning and/or implementation grants. That is a mouthful. So this is, next slide, this is the third in our series of webinars. We started last July with your own data and the topic of a dozen policy questions you can answer with your agency's administrative data. In October, we expanded the available data and focused on mapping, talking about comparing your administrative data with other data. The slides and transcript from that webinar, titled Mapping Answers to Childcare Questions, Comparing Your Administrative Data with Other Data, have recently been posted on OPRE's website, and also the Urban Institute has a web page with links. It's got products from the center. Eleanor, could you put the links in the chat box, maybe the links to both the first webinar and the second webinar? So as she does that, let me focus to today's webinar. In this one, we expand yet again to talk about gathering new data to gain stakeholder perspectives. As we say in the title, you will be answering yet more childcare policy questions by pairing stakeholder perspectives with your data. Let me go to the next slide and introduce our first presenter, Gina Adams. Gina is a senior fellow at the Urban Institute, and she's a national expert on the factors that shape the affordability, quality, and supply of childcare and early education services. Gina has done extensive research on the childcare subsidy system, and understanding the experiences of parents, providers, and frontline workers, so to make the system work better for each. Gina also directs the Urban Institute's Kids in Context initiative. I imagine many of you have encountered Gina over the years. Gina, I turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Julia, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today. As Julia noted in her introduction, I have been actually conducting research on the child care subsidy system for an astounding more than 30 years, since before the current federal system existed. And most of my research has focused on understanding stakeholder perspectives, so I was delighted when I was invited to be part of your conversation today. As I show in the next slide, today I'm going to be focusing on a little bit of introductory conversation about the why, the who, and the how of including stakeholder perspectives in research on trying to answer some CCDF policy questions. And I want to start out by framing this generally and giving us a couple of examples. So I'm going to talk about three questions. Why do you want to reach out to stakeholders? Who are some of the stakeholders you might want to reach out to? And how can you gather the information from them? So next slide, please. So why reach out to stakeholders? Well, basically, I think we have a lot of questions where it's really important to talk to the folks who have a unique knowledge or perspective on the answers. For example, we might want to talk to them first to design new policies. So kinds of questions we want to think about are, what do we need to understand about the problem, and what do we need to know about the context? We also might want to talk to them second to understand and strengthen current policies. Is our policy working? If it's not working, why and for whom? And then third, a really important piece is you want to do it to build buy-in and engagement. Being listened to and part of a solution really builds partnership, which is key for moving forward any policy agenda. In the next slide, please. In the next slide, we talk about who you should reach out to. So the who really depends on your questions. The experts that you might want to talk to can be in the following categories. It can be kinds of people who are making the policy, which would be, for example, administrators or agency staff. It could be to the people who are implementing the policy, and that would be folks like caseworkers or eligibility workers or community service agency staff. It can also be the people who are seeing or experiencing what is happening on the ground level as the policy is being implemented. It can be folks who understand related policy areas or issues that have an impact on the issue that you're thinking about. We also might want to hear from people who are knowledgeable about the broader child care market or context, like child care resource and referral staff or employers. And then last, we might talk to people who understand the context that that policy is operating within, which is really important in order to understand how to design it, what kind of problems the policy is likely to face, and what kind of pitfalls. All of these different kinds of people can help you understand what is happening and why, depending on your research question. In the next slide, I thought it would be useful to make it real by providing two examples. One is hypothetical, and one is from my own experience. First, the hypothetical experience. For example, let's say that you're worried about the decline in the number of family child care providers in your state, which is an issue that many people are quite concerned about right now. And you want to do something to take action, develop some policies to help stabilize the supply. So who might be able to help you understand that problem? Well, obviously, family child care providers would be first, but there are many other knowledgeable stakeholders that would provide very useful information in trying to understand this issue. There are people who are providing training and supports to providers. There are people who are licensing staff who might interact with providers or have different kinds of requirements for them and can see that impact. There are individuals involved with systems like QRIS and zoning that also have an impact on these kinds of providers. There's advocates or others who have been working with family child care providers or watching the trends and have an in-depth perspective on the problem. So all of these are people who could help you understand the problem of the decline in family child care and the context. And they could help you understand how these issues might play out differently for different providers or in different parts of the state. Stakeholder input is also critically important to understand how policies are experienced and implemented. So the second example is from work that we did where we've been looking at a number of issues in the state, including a 12-month redetermination period. This is interestingly in a state that had this policy before reauthorization and had for a long time. But when we talked to caseworkers, we found that many of them across the state were actually requiring parents to come in every 3 months to prove that they were still eligible because these caseworkers were so concerned about fraud and they were so worried about the families on the waiting list. I can still remember the state administrator's face when he heard that what they were saying. He was absolutely shocked. He had no idea that their 12-month redetermination policy existed only on paper, and no idea that the caseworkers were interpreting the state's concern about fraud and turning that into quarterly redetermination requirements. This is actually something that we have experienced over and over in our work, which is how different the frontline reality can be from what the state agency believes the policy is. Often we found the implementation was such that the policy may not be working at all the way it was intended, but there really was no way to find that out without talking with the people who were implementing it or experiencing it. Similarly, I remember a project when we did focus groups with parents in 2 different local subsidy agencies in the same large U.S. city, just on different sides of the town, and how the findings were so different from one agency to the other. It had the same policy structure, but the local implementation across these 2 sites was incredibly different so that parent experiences were as well. In this case, it was the local agency leadership that seemed to be driving many of the differences. So as you can see from the next slide, the last question I want to touch base on is how do you reach out and collect information from stakeholders? And there's many different ways to do this. First, there are different types of data collection. Now, I've most often used focus groups and what we call semi-structured interviews, which are interviews that have a set of questions that allow you to cover a common core set of topics, but allow flexibility for the respondent to go into depth and take their answers where they lead them. These approaches are particularly useful if you want to explore the complexity of a situation and you want the stakeholders to be able to communicate that to you and help lead you to insights you may not have had. But there are other approaches. Surveys, for example, can be excellent if you already know the set of possible answers that your respondents will have, and you just want to know which one reflects their experience or beliefs. You can also do this in other ways, like holding open meetings with stakeholders, asking for input, etc. All of these have pros and cons depending on the question you want to answer. You can also do these different approaches using different modes. You can do it in person, you can do it by phone, you can do it web-based, you can do it virtual. Again, each of these have pros and cons depending on your goal, who you're talking to, and what you're trying to get. The choice of type and mode really depends on your study purpose and research question. As I just mentioned, different questions require different types of data collection. It can depend on your resources. Obviously, your funding and staff resources will dictate your approach. It depends on timing, how long you have to do the work and how quickly you need the answers. And finally, it depends on what is appropriate for your stakeholders that you're trying to talk to. You wouldn't, for example, want to do a town hall meeting for stakeholders for whom confidentiality is really important. In my next slide, I want to leave you with a few basic principles that might be useful as you move forward. First of all, I think it's really important to design the approach to ensure participation from the respondents you most need to hear from. And that may mean that you have to do extra outreach or special efforts to get their engagement if there are populations who are hard to reach or might be resistant to talking with you. Second, the process must support honest responses, which can be very difficult if the respondent has an answer that they think that you might not want to hear. Third, it's important to ensure confidentiality if the respondents are vulnerable in any way, or if they might feel cautious about sharing their perspective, or if the information is sensitive. This is important because you need to build trust, and this can sometimes mean that you might have to bring in third neutral parties to do this kind of work. Finally, it's important to recognize the limitations in the quality of the data if you don't meet these three conditions. If you aren't hearing from the folks you need to hear from, or if the respondents aren't giving you straight answers because they're scared or don't trust, it means that your information isn't going to be very good and it's not going to be useful to you in forming your policy questions. So I'm going to stop now and I'm going to turn the microphone back to Julia.
Oh, thank you, Gina, for that great introduction to today's topic. I want to take a pause to see if anyone has any questions for Gina before we turn to our next two speakers. If you have a question, please type it into the chat box while the question is fresh in your mind. Now, also, if you want to contact Gina after the presentation, there's her email address on the screen, gadams@urban.org. I am not seeing questions, so I think I will move to our next presenter. Although if you have questions and are still typing them, please continue. We will have ample time for questions at the end. So throughout the presentation, type your questions. As you can see from our next slide, we will now be hearing from Julia Henley, who is a professor in the School of Social Service Administration at the University of Chicago. Julia studies the intersection of family poverty, employment, and public policy, especially childcare and family policy. She's conducted several projects in collaboration with state and local policy actors with the goal of improving the effectiveness of childcare and early education programs. She's going to share about one of those projects now. Over to you, Julie.
Thanks a lot, Julia, and good afternoon, everyone. So I'd like to talk about how stakeholder interviews have helped me understand subsidy access and childcare quality challenges. And I'm going to use a concrete example from the Illinois-New York Childcare Research Partnership Study. So as you can see from this next slide, in my presentation today, I'd like to share with you some insights about how stakeholder interviews can both elaborate and clarify knowledge that's been gained from administrative and survey data. So I'm going to start by providing a very brief study background, and then I'm going to organize my remarks around three central questions. First, I'll describe who we sought perspectives from in this study and how we identified these people. Second, I'll explain how we gathered data from stakeholders and why we used the method we did. And third, I'll share what we learned from stakeholders that gave us a different perspective, or what I see at least as a unique perspective from what we were able to learn from the other parts of our study. So next slide, please. The study that I'll be referring to, the Illinois-New York Child Care Research Partnership Study, or CCRP as we call it, was a multi-year partnership between researchers at the University of Chicago, at the Urban Institute, and state and child care administrators and staff in 2 regions in Illinois, as well as 2 regions in New York. So to conduct the study, let me first say that we received really generous funding from the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation at the Administration for Children and Families, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. The goal of the project was to address research gaps related to 2 issues. First, we wanted to understand the determinants of child care subsidy program dynamics. That is, why is it that people leave the program? And second, we wanted to understand the implications of this subsidy instability when people leave for the continuity and quality of child care arrangements. Next slide, please. So let me briefly describe the 2 phases of CCRP. The first phase explored subsidy instability from the perspective of subsidy program participants, whereas the second phase brought in the perspective of subsidy program administrators and caseworkers, the staff involved with child care and early education quality systems, as well as child care providers. The study took place, as I mentioned, in 2 regions in Illinois and 2 regions in New York, and specifically, we targeted Nassau County and Westchester County in New York, as well as Cook County, and then a 7-county downstate region in southwestern Illinois. Next slide. So this slide provides a diagram of the 2 phases of the study, illustrating what sources of data were used in each phase and their relationship to each other. So phase 1, as I said, focused on subsidized families themselves. So in this phase, we had 3 sources of data. It included a longitudinal analysis of subsidy records, and then a survey of a random sample of over 600 parents who were receiving child care subsidies, and then in-depth interviews with a subsample of survey respondents. In particular, we did over 80 parent interviews, and those were semi-structured interviews. In the second phase of the project, we did a provider study that analyzed provider characteristics gathered from the 2 states' child care resource and referral databases, as well as a sample of child care providers from each of the 4 counties. And again, those provider interviews, we used semi-structured interviews. In the second phase of the study, we also included case studies of each of the 4 sites. In addition to a review of policy memos and other subsidy policy documents, the case studies involved interviews with quality rating and improvement system personnel, as well as subsidy stakeholders. And it's really these interviews that I want to mostly focus on today. That's the point of the red arrow there on the slide for those of you that are following along on the PowerPoint. So next slide. So let me say a bit more about who we sought perspectives from and how we identified them. So in addition to the parent interviews in phase 1 and the provider interviews in phase 2, for the case studies, we interviewed a range of policy and program staff across all levels of QRIS and subsidy systems. And this included upper level administrators, really the architects of each of those systems, as well as program managers at a local level, and frontline subsidy and QRIS staff who were delivering policy. We used several strategies to identify the policy and program staff that we wanted to interview. We relied in our case study on document review and other parts of the project to identify the job titles and the positions that we wanted to target, that we thought would be most important to really understanding the questions that we put forth. We then consulted with our state and local partners who were central to the project to identify specific people, specific individuals to interview at all levels of both systems, the QRIS system and the subsidy system. And then finally, after we conducted each interview, we asked the person we interviewed for referrals, people that they thought would be good for us to interview that might think similarly or differently from their own perspective. Next slide, please. So how is it that we gathered the data from stakeholders, and why did we do it the way we did? Well, in addition to using existing childcare subsidy records and telephone surveys, as I suggested, we relied heavily on semi-structured interviews that allowed for us to gather information in a conversational, open-ended fashion. These interviews were audio recorded, transcribed, coded, and content reviewed. We chose to conduct semi-structured interviews because we thought this would allow us to gather novel data and learn about experiences in the words of the interviewees themselves, rather than only through administrative records and survey items. We also wanted people to feel free to speak, and so we chose a semi-structured interview format instead of a focus group format in this particular study, although I've used focus group formats in other studies, depending on the research question. The stakeholder interviews helped us understand the distinct perspectives of staff, taking into account where they sit in the organization that they're in. Next slide, please. So what did we learn from the quality rating and improvement system and the subsidy stakeholders? How did it give us a different perspective from what we had already learned from the administrative and survey data that we gathered and analyzed in other parts of our project? So the stakeholder perspectives, I think, helped us understand subsidy dynamics from a system perspective. It provided a window into the process of implementing policy and programs and highlighted the ways in which policy as written and policy as practiced can differ. I really think this was probably the most critical piece of this project, what it allowed us to do. The stakeholder interviews also gave us a perspective into the everyday experiences of subsidy and QRIS staff and how their perspectives about the subsidy application and recertification process compare with those of providers and families. So we could kind of triangulate these views between stakeholders in the system, childcare providers, and subsidized families themselves. Overall, these interviews, I would say, provided context that aided interpretation for each of the other parts of the study. Okay, next slide, please. In my closing couple minutes, let me provide two brief examples of what we learned from this study. I could go on, and I'm not going to, but we have several takeaways, I think, from this study, and I want to just mention two right now that have to do specifically with the value of these QRIS and subsidy stakeholder interviews. The first example shows how these semi-structured interviews generally can help us gain a better understanding of survey findings. In this case, the survey data from subsidized parents indicated that administrative factors, things such as processing delays, for example, are critical contributors of to subsidy exit. From semi-structured interviews, we learned from the perspective of parents, providers, and direct subsidy staff and program managers why these delays occur and why other administrative challenges seem to take place. We found that factors such as inefficient eligibility processes, overburdened staff, time constraints, and infrastructure deficits were important, and this came up across the different stakeholder interviews. The subsidy stakeholder interviews in particular also revealed several suggestions for improvement around eligibility and redetermination processes, as well as some creative workarounds that subsidy eligibility workers use to improve efficiency and accuracy. Next slide, please. A second example comes from the phase 2 study that used data from child care resource and referral databases to map child care supply over time. We found that quality investments, especially in Illinois, have resulted in a clear increase in the supply of quality rated programs and a reduction in the distance between where families with low incomes live and programs that have a quality rating. That kind of mapping we could not have done with interviews alone. So that was done through using existing records. Yet from parent interviews, we were able to identify challenges that parents had in finding quality care and a concern that parents are not receiving sufficient help in childcare searches for quality arrangements. But then from the policy and program staff in QRIS and subsidy systems, we were able to learn about factors that make it difficult for caseworkers to support parental searches for quality arrangements. Some of these factors included limits to cross-system collaboration between QRIS and subsidy systems, the narrowness of job definitions, which sometimes limited the scope of work that was allowable for a particular eligibility worker, for example. Overburdened staff due to high caseloads and poor infrastructure, and time constraints that can also be the result of high caseloads and overburden. As with the prior example, the stakeholder interviews provided several suggestions for improvement, some of which they believed would make it easier to match parents with quality childcare arrangements. Next slide, please. So in this final slide of my presentation, I would like to just invite people to ask questions, typing them into the chat box as before. And I'd also like to share the names of 3 reports that came out of the CCRP project broadly that provide further information about our partnership. And these are the Determinants of Subsidy Stability and Childcare Continuity report that sort of summarizes the full project by myself and my co-authors. That's a 2015 paper. Learning from childcare providers across settings. The lead author there is Heather Sandstrom, a co-PI on the project, and the rest of the research team. That's a 2018 report. And Mapping Childcare Demand and the Supply of Care for Subsidized Families, also lead author Heather Sandstrom and our team of researchers and collaborators. And that's also a 2018 report. I think Eleanor is going to put those links in the chat box for you if she hasn't already. I think she already has. She's quicker than I am. And I'm also happy to answer questions if you contact me, Julia Henley, at my email, which is jhenley, there's only one E in Henley, so that's JHENLY @uchicago.edu. And with that, I will turn the presentation back to the other Julia, Julia Isaacs.
Thank you. Thank you. I guess I'll say Julie Henley to avoid confusing our audience. 2 Julias in one webinar. We may just have all our questions at the end, but we always like to pause in case there are questions specific to the talk we just heard. Not seeing questions. I'm going to move to the next slide and introduce my colleague, Teresa Derrick Mills. Teresa is a principal research associate at the Urban Institute, and she's the deputy director of the center that is hosting this webinar. Teresa has a PhD in public policy and public administration, and her work focuses on studying the intersections of policy and implementation for vulnerable populations, and also improving the translation of research to practice. And her work is informed by 15 years where she was working in North Carolina on developing and managing child care support services. Okay, Teresa, let's turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Julia. Today, I'm going to talk about what stakeholder interviews help us understand about non-traditional hour childcare in the District of Columbia. I'll be talking about a piece of a study that I conducted with other colleagues at the Urban Institute, including Heather Sandstrom, who is the principal investigator, and Erica Greenberg, who is another senior researcher. If you tuned in to our last webinar, you heard Erica talk about a different part of that study. Next slide. The study goals were shaped by the District of Columbia's Child Care Study Act of 2017. It mandated a study to determine the number of child development facilities with non-traditional hours in the district that is sufficient to meet the needs of district families. It defined non-traditional hours facilities as those open outside 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. Monday through Friday or on a 24-hour basis. They asked that we include 4 elements in our study: assess demand, examining the need for licensed child care during non-traditional hours, assess supply or existing licensed child care available during non-traditional hours, determine gaps or unmet needs for non-traditional hour care, and provide policy solutions, including recommendations for expanding the number of licensed child care programs offering non-traditional hour care. Next slide. So what data sources did we use? We used multiple sources of administrative data, including child care resource and referral requests from parents seeking care and child care licensing data to understand the supply of care. We paired the administrative data with other existing data, including American Community Survey and the Survey of Income and Program Participation, to get more information on potential demand and better understand gaps. And we spoke to stakeholders to get perspectives on all of these things, on demand, supply, gaps, and understanding the context, barriers, and possible policy solutions. My remarks today focus on this last category. Next slide. In this slide, I review the stakeholders consulted, who and how. We spoke to 28 individuals who were not child care operators. These included people who shape CCDF policy, such as individuals in the CCDF Lead Agency and elected officials, people who implement CCDF policy, including staff in the Child Care Resource and Referral Agency, Child Care Licensing, Child Care Subsidy, and others, child care operators, including a survey of child care centers and homes licensed to provide non-traditional hour care, and interviews with some child care centers and homes not offering non-traditional hour care. We also spoke to other DC government officials, and we spoke to employers, employer associations, and a variety of others. We mostly gathered insights from the stakeholders through semi-structured interviews that we conducted on the telephone. Speaking to individuals on the phone saved time, which allowed us to speak to more people. And we knew the types of people we were speaking to were used to talking on the phone. In other words, that wasn't going to be a barrier. And in this study, we had about 4 months to gather and analyze all the data, so we were not able to include parent perspectives or guardians, but we did recommend that conversations be held with them in the future. Today, I'm going to focus on why we spoke to and what we learned from employers and city planning officials. Next slide. As Gina noted in her earlier remarks, one of the reasons why we want to talk with stakeholders is to better understand the problem. The data we had examined demonstrated that there was a potential problem. There's a large gap between the number of children whose parents work non-traditional hours and the amount of licensed care offered. And we looked at this a variety of different ways, during particular time periods, for particular ages of children, in particular locations, and you can see that if you look at the report. But then the question is, okay, so there's this difference, there's a gap, but is the gap really a problem? Do we have a reason to believe parents would use the care if more were provided? And what are the reasons for the gaps? Why don't more providers offer non-traditional hour care? Next slide. So why talk to providers? Employers. Employers operating during non-traditional hours can best help us answer the question, is the gap a real problem? We used the data and other interviews to determine which employers to reach out to. Next slide. We wanted to understand employer concerns about limited non-traditional hour care. This quote from one local assistant manager expressed a common sentiment. Having more flexible child care hours would get us a larger pool of job candidates. I think our candidate pool is self-selecting because of the hours people have to work. A lot of people just cross off this industry because they know they can't work those hours since they have no child care. Many employers also said they did not know how to help families find or access the care they needed. Next slide. We also spoke to employers to gather insights on parental challenges and preferences based on what they knew. This quote from one local supervisor was typical for what we heard. A lot of people have to scramble to find childcare with a family member, and if the family member falls through, and that's a recurrent problem, then they can end up losing their jobs. It's hard for single parents, young parents, or when both parents need work odd hours. Next slide. In this study, our funders asked that we make policy recommendations for reducing the gaps. One policy recommendation shaped by pairing employer interviews and provider interviews was a recommendation to stabilize demand by helping child care providers partner with businesses. Employers expressed a potential interest in collaborating with child care operators, but were not sure how to make the connections. And some providers who were already offering non-traditional hour care said it was helpful to focus on a particular set of parents working for the same types of employers. Next slide. So, child care licensing is not the only process that determines where and when child care programs can operate. Zoning is a city planning function, and so talking to city planning officials is useful in helping us understand what potential barriers are to offering non-traditional hour care. Next slide. So as a city planning function, zoning focuses on the rules and regulations about the way space can be used in cities and other local areas. What parts of the community can people live in? What parts of the community can businesses operate in? What kinds of businesses can operate in what parts of the community? And what hours can those businesses operate? As you can see, child care programs are a type of business, and so zoning affects where and when they can operate. Next slide. So in talking to city planners, they helped us understand how might zoning requirements affect the availability of non-traditional hour care in DC. Much of the information was available online, but hey, we're not zoning experts, and it was kind of hard to read. So we contacted zoning officials to hear their interpretation of what the regulations were and what the processes are. We learned that, in fact, zoning rules had recently changed to make it easier to open new child care programs in many zones throughout the city and to reduce conflicts between zoning and licensing requirements. We also learned that the zoning agency has a liaison to help child care providers navigate the system. But zoning officials also confirmed what we heard from home-based providers who wanted to get a special exception to care for more than 6 children in their homes, that there was a fee of more than $1,000 to apply for this exception, and that the process usually took about 6 months, and that community input was required, particularly approval from the Advisory Neighborhood Commission, or ANC. Next slide. The following policy recommendations were shaped by our interviews with city planning officials and child care providers. Improve outreach and consumer education, engage with zoning and advisory neighborhood commissions on child care needs and process for approving care. Some stakeholders thought ANCs might be more receptive to more non-traditional hour care in their communities if they better understood benefits to their residents and that noise and traffic was likely to be low. Also, differentiate supports to meet providers' startup and ongoing needs. Provide help with the zoning application fee, since $1,000 can be a lot for a family child care provider. And help providers understand the zoning process, especially timelines and who they need to talk to. Next slide. In short, stakeholder interviews helped us confirm that the gap between non-traditional hour supply and potential demand shown in the data was a real gap. Parents really do need more options, and improving information, awareness, and coordination could support more supply. Next slide. I welcome your questions. You can put them in the chat box or email me at Teresa Derrick Mills at tderrick-mills@urban.org. You can also learn more about the ways we included stakeholder insights in our report, Non-Traditional Hour Child Care in the District of Columbia, published in 2019, co-authored by Heather Sandstrom, myself, and many others. And I believe Eleanor is sharing that link with you in the chat box now. When you take a look at the report, you can see Appendix B. You can find the basic set of questions that we use when speaking to people other than child care providers. And now I'll turn it back to Julia Isaacs.
Thank you, Teresa. I do think zoning officials is an interesting set of stakeholders, and certainly employers. We did in this, we wanted to share examples with folks other than interviewing providers and families, just to help broaden the definition of stakeholders. Although of course each of these studies did also talk to providers, and in one case families. So I'm seeing a question here, which I think I will pause for. I'm eager to turn to our final presenter, but oh, I see a couple of questions. Excellent. We'll start with the first question I saw. It's not the first question, but this would be for any of the three that have spoken so far. Did you use any fiscal data in the study, and how? Maybe we should start with Teresa, because this may be related to your study.
So I think what they mean by fiscal data is funding data. And I don't think that was a key part of the study. What they wanted us to do was to understand the demand and the supply and the gaps and provide potential solutions, but that was not really a focus of the DC non-traditional hours study.
Okay, I hope that answered Becky's question. If it didn't, Becky, feel free to type in it. Again, I think Teresa and I were interpreting it that way. But and here's a question for any of the researchers. Did you interview parents who did not use child care subsidy, or providers who did not participate in child care subsidy programs? And the part two of that question is, would you recommend creating separate focus groups? One group for those that participate in subsidy programs and one that does not participate. Who would like to answer that question?
Julia, this is Gina. I can take a whack at it. I'm going to actually refer to a study that we did actually 10 years ago on child care providers in the subsidy system in 5 counties. And it's actually, I think, the last major study that looked at child care providers and subsidy system policies and was the basis for a lot of the provider-friendly policies and the reauthorization. In that one, we did do a survey where we talked to both providers who, we interviewed both providers who were and were not, and we did focus groups with them as well. In that case, we very much wanted to have them be separate because the questions were about, partially about experiences with the subsidy system and perspectives and why they did or didn't participate. So separating them out into those 2 different groups was very important for that study. I think the larger question is the composition of a focus group and how you break it up. It really depends on your research questions and what group of people you think will be able to have a bit more of a shared experience so that you can kind of get deeper into that experience, if that makes sense. Having people with very different experiences in a focus group when you're trying to hone in on one question can be a little challenging. Doesn't mean to say they have to experience it the same way, but they have to have knowledge about what you're asking for. I hope that made sense.
It made sense to me, Gina. Thank you. Yeah, there is an art as well as a science to doing focus groups, and what you described of the common focus was helpful. Would anyone else, would any of the other researchers like to answer this question? Add anything?
This is Julie Henley. I would just say that for our Illinois-New York Child Care Partnership, our key question was what explained movement off and on the subsidy program. So we were really targeting families that were part of the child care system at one point in time. So we weren't asking the question, what are barriers to getting on the program to begin with? Having said that, I think because we were kind of interviewing people at different points in time in their trajectory, their subsidy trajectory, we often talked to families who were not currently receiving subsidies. And so we got a fair amount of information from those families. And then from the provider perspective, we really were targeting providers that had some experience with the subsidy program. And what we found when we interviewed the providers is that some of them, though they varied quite a bit in what we talked about as the density of their subsidy, the density of subsidized families that they served. So in some cases, a provider, when we interviewed them, they might not have had any subsidized family in their program, whereas other providers had, you know, the vast majority of their clients, of their families were subsidized. So the providers that we interviewed varied quite a bit, but they all had at least some knowledge of the subsidy program. And I will bypass part 2 to that question because I haven't done a lot of focus groups. I've done some, but I haven't done a lot of focus groups. I would guess that for most research questions, you'd want to separate, you'd want 2 different focus groups, that one with a group that had subsidy experience and one with a group that didn't. But I think it does really depend on the question you're asking.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate the questions. It's great to know, to have that interaction with and we'll have time at the very end for additional, but I'd like to turn to the next slide and introduce, we brought somebody on board to react, Linda Satterfield. She'll provide both comments and reactions from a state agency perspective. Many of you may know Linda Satterfield, who has 40 years experience managing programs in state government in Illinois. She served as the state child care administrator for Illinois from 1998 to 2015. After a brief hiatus, she is back as interim associate director for the Illinois Office of Early Childhood, assisting Illinois as they contemplate major changes in funding and governance for early childhood under the leadership of Governor Pritzker. Linda, could you provide us with a state perspective on what you've just been hearing from Gina, Julie, and Teresa?
Well, thank you, Julia. And it's a pleasure to be speaking with all of you today on data and stakeholder perspective, which are integral to the work that I do and that greatly helps inform the decisions that I make in the early childhood programs that I manage. You know, as state child care administrators, we look at data almost every day, whether it's dashboard data that helps us monitor daily operations, data to complete required reports to funders, data to measure the impact of policy decisions or general trends that may be emerging. And often as we look at data, something piques our interest, questions start to form. We wonder why we're seeing these numbers and what is this data telling us? And as is natural, we all tend to look at data through our own lens, and sometimes that isn't enough to complete the picture. So for me, stakeholder perspective adds color to the black and white of the data that we look at and may provide something that we don't see or that isn't readily apparent. Let me kind of give you an example of what I mean and use a why, who, how of an issue that emerged in Illinois and what we did as a result of what we learned when we examined this issue. And this goes back to my very early years as a state child care administrator and in the early years of the Child Care Development Fund. And at that time, the use of exempt care in Illinois was very high. We had close to 60% of our children that were using some type of exempt care, primarily family, friend, and neighbor care. And the question to us was, why was there such a high use of that care when our policy was set up, our eligibility policy was set up to treat all types of care in the same manner, meaning our co-payment was the same regardless of your choice of care. There were no restrictions on the approval of care. And basically the eligibility was set up to support parental choice of care. So why, with all of those factors and policy being the same, did we have such a high use of that care? So we participated in a 3-year research project from 2001 to 2004 called the Illinois Study of License Exempt Care. And our principal researchers in that were Steve Anderson, Dawn Ramsberg, and I believe Jeff Scott, who were at the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana at the time. And as expected, there was a very in-depth analysis of administrative data. We had lots of data to study. They looked at patterns, trends, ages of kids, length of time using care, the number of different providers used over periods of time, a very, very rich analysis of the data. We also included in the research project a stakeholder perspective component using key informant interviews and focus groups with parents and providers. So all told, over 700 interviews were conducted. And some of what we learned from those interviews and focus groups really stays with me to this day. So focus groups with parents, I wouldn't say I had a lot of surprises with what that yielded. It was confirmation maybe of what we thought was involved in choosing family, friend, and neighbor care. Parents indicated the primary reason for choosing care was trust in the caregiver, followed by convenience and location. And trust, of course, centered around knowing that their child would be safe because they knew the caregiver, and in most cases, the caregiver was related to them. So they felt confident that their child would be cared for in a loving environment. Convenience and location revealed a lot to us about work shifts, transportation, flexibility of the provider to be forgiving of last-minute changes in work hours, a lot of what we know that our low-income parents had to deal with, especially in their early employment efforts. So again, not too many surprises on the parent response, but it was the provider responses that made the impression. And most of the providers indicated that they provided care as a favor or to help out the parent. Close to 90% of the providers indicated they'd provide that care even if the subsidy ended. And I will tell you, in times of lean budgets, that statistic always sticks with me. I've never had to act on it, but there's just something about a reassurance that 90% of that care would go on if the subsidy ended. But gladly, I didn't have to act on that. The really interesting piece was 75% of family, friend, and neighbor caregivers responded that they would be interested in getting training to help them better care for the children. And that was unexpected. We really hadn't considered that family, friend, and neighbor caregivers would be interested in training or professional development opportunities. Although nothing in our system would prevent them from accessing training, we offered a pretty robust training schedule through our child care resource and referral agencies, but we really hadn't done anything to attempt to market training to them or to do any type of specialized outreach to them. So as a result of what we learned through those stakeholder interviews, we used quality dollars to fund grants for innovative outreach and training initiatives with family, friend, and neighbor caregivers. And we eventually set up a 3-tiered training program as part of our quality rating and improvement system that led to the issuance of a level 1 credential and provided a higher reimbursement rate. In fact, and this part was really surprising, 10% of providers that completed that training went on to get their license. So that became a small feeder program for increasing our licensed home pool. And I don't know that we would have implemented anything like that if we wouldn't have had the input from those stakeholders. So for me, that's an example of something that kind of completes the story that started with data. So whether you do something on a small scale locally within your state or as part of a national study, you should share what you learned from a stakeholder perspective, especially if you've made a change as a result. I think it can help inform decision making for all of us. And I think there's a lot of change and flexibility in the reauthorization language for CCDBG, and I believe much of it is informed from what was learned through research and stakeholder perspective over the last 20 years. I'll turn it back to you, Julia.
Thank you, Linda. We're so happy you were able to join us today and share your perspectives. And I appreciate that example about the license exempt family, friend, and neighbor care. it is interesting when research confirms what you thought you knew, and it's also really interesting when you find something surprising, like realizing how many you had not realized how many of the family, friend, and neighbor providers would be interested in becoming licensed, or certainly interested in becoming having more training for working with parents. And I appreciate what you said about how it's talking to families, to providers, to staff, to other stakeholders. Has some of that research has really influenced some of the changes made in the 2014 reauthorization, and I think we should thank some of the researchers on this panel for all that great research. Let me turn to the next slide. I think it's going to be a question slide. We appreciate the questions you've already submitted. Questions for any of the four presenters? We're also open to your comments or reflections. Just type it into the chat box. I'm seeing appreciation for the concrete examples from the presenters. Yes, that makes it more real for people. Thank you for that comment. I guess while we're waiting for questions, I'd like to ask one, although maybe Linda's answered it. I just love examples of things that have changed as a result of talking to stakeholders, where you've sort of gained a new perspective. And don't know, you all sort of touched on this. Would anyone like to amplify how talking to stakeholders gave you a new perspective?
I have one example that I'm still not sure what to do with it, but I think it was a really important finding that has kind of led to a lot of consternation and sort of head scratching. And that is, we learned that when we were just trying in our study using administrative data to understand movement on and off the child care subsidy program and calculating the length of spells, for example, and the length of gaps between spells and then returns. We had an answer, right? It was good, hard data, and we could say, you know, the average subsidy spell in Cook County was about 9 months based on that data, just as an example. And this was several years ago. Then in our interviews with parents, we found somewhat of a mismatch between what that kind of hard subsidy data suggested and then how parents described their movement on and off the program. And some of it was just, you know, misremembering months, but it turned out it was more than that. It was also parents not always knowing that they were on the program when they were on the program, and not knowing they were off the program when they were off the program. So I think one of the things that we learned was that the administrative data does not always fit perfectly with parent and providers' understandings of their time on the program. And so we've spent a lot of time thinking about why there's that mismatch, other than just, you know, simply misremembering. And a lot of it had to do, we think at least, with kind of administrative challenges, delays in communication between parents and the office, you know, misunderstandings about what it means to be on the program. So after filling out an application, not understanding sometimes that isn't sufficient to be on the program. And so the sort of, yeah, I mean, I'll just end there. The sort of disconnect between what administrative data tells us that seems like kind of a right answer, and then how parents and in some cases providers understand what what is happening. And that sort of raises this, I think, broader issue that Gina and I both talked about, which is it's really important to know about kind of policy as written and policy as analyzed, I'll add, at the quantitative level, as well as policy as practiced, and then policy as understood by participants in the system.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you. Yeah, these concrete examples and knowing that you learn something new sometimes, which is what, as researchers and as state administrators, we want to know what's happening. I'm seeing a few comments. One person, Kim, is saying, talking to stakeholders seems to have revealed assumptions that are unknowingly held, which hold things in place, even if unintentionally. Appreciate that comment. Revealing assumptions that people are holding. Gina, I think one of your example that the state administrator had an assumption that the policies were one way, that the policies in the books were actually being followed. That was an assumption, wasn't it?
Yes, it absolutely was. And we found that over and over again. We did a large study called the Work Support Strategies Project that we did technical assistance and looked really at how the subsidy system was operating at the ground level in 6 states. And I'd say in every single one of them, there were policies in place that just were not being implemented at the local level at all in the way that the state thought it was. And there was a lot of low-hanging fruit to be fixed that made the system work better. So I think it's a very useful strategy to help improve policies, just to find out whether they're working as we planned them to.
Julia, can I react? Kim Engelman has a comment that she posted on there. Can I give a reaction to that?
Yes. Could you share the comment for the people that may not be able to see it?
Sure. Kim says the uptake of 10% of family, friend, and neighbor providers who took steps to become licensed is incredible. This may be a scalable way to address the shortage of child care providers that all states are experiencing presently. And I appreciate that. We were surprised at the number of providers that went on to become licensed, and we were very intentional with the way we set up that training. I don't know if your state has a career lattice, but we have one in Illinois, and so we took our early childhood level 1 credential and broke up the training requirements for that into 3 tiers. And at the completion of each tier, we increased the reimbursement rate and also offered, provider resources, small grants to provide resources for the care provided in the home. So we think that we were encouraging providers to begin to look at this as perhaps a career path, and by structuring the tiers in a way that they ended up with a credential, they were able to step into working in a center or a home, licensed center or home, if they wanted to do that. And again, many decided to go ahead and get licensed on their own as a result of that. So I think it was really for us, again, something that was unexpected, but we were really happy to see the number that decided to go on and get licensed. It greatly increased their reimbursement as well, because certainly the license rates were higher than the rates that were being paid to exempt providers. So it was a win-win as far as we were concerned.
Thank you, Linda. And as you were talking about and the question from Kim about ways of getting family, friend, and neighbor providers to become licensed, it touches on an earlier question, which I was about to read out. And Linda, you might have a response where we have about 5 minutes more, so we have short responses. But can you say anything as to why, I think Gina mentioned this too, Gina might have a comment, why is the decline in family care viewed as a negative trend that needs to be addressed?
Linda, do you want to answer that, or do you want me to take
Well,
over first?
why don't you go ahead, Gina? That was kind of like the first shot on your presentation there.
I'll just make it very briefly. Family child care is an incredibly important part of the child care system. That's one of the few parts of the system that's both licensed and is very flexible to meet families' needs in terms of hours. Many families actually prefer home-based settings, and family child care is the part of that system that we actually can touch most easily through policy. Right now, the majority of low-income kids actually are in unlicensed, home-based, family, friend, and neighbor care settings, and family child care is the part of that world that is part of our public system. So many of us who are concerned about ensuring access for low-income families in the full range of work worlds that they are in are very concerned about the move of the public system towards kind of more center-based care, which is a very important part of the system as well. But we have to recognize that there's a chunk of families who can't really use that form of care, and so trying to sustain and support the quality of the home-based sector is an important priority as well. I'm curious, Linda, whether that would be your thought.
Yes, Gina, I would agree. I mean, I think it all goes back to supporting parent choice and respecting that parents make the choice that they feel is best for their child, as well as what works for them as a family. So I think family care is definitely an important part of our overall structure. And that's part of the reason that we decided to take efforts to improve the quality of care provided in those settings and take steps to try and address that. You take the improvements to where the care is being provided and not expect families to make changes in their arrangements or their choices to suit what you may think might be better care. It's try and improve the overall quality wherever those children are being cared for.
Thank you. Thank you, Linda, and thank you, Gina. So I see that we're getting close. I like to respect people's time, so I think I'm going to move to our closing few minutes. We appreciate the questions you're sending us. We also would love to get some direct feedback so we can tailor our future webinars to meet your needs, and we are happy to say we will be doing 2 more webinars later this year. But Eleanor, could you post 2 poll questions? And then I'll have a slide about further resources. The poll is, did you find that this webinar was a good use of your time? And you have a choice of strongly agree, agree, neutral, disagree, or strongly disagree. And I believe you can see our second question too. The second question, don't mean to rush you, but my knowledge or skills have increased as a result of this session. And again, 5 choices between strongly agree and disagree. And in addition to the poll, I am seeing, and everyone can see if they open their chat box, people are talking about, appreciate that this is motivating to hear this, and appreciate the compliment about the diversity of and combination of expertise on this panel. Thank you. Eleanor, does it look like we've gotten a good number of votes?
I'm going to give it 10 more seconds and then we can close the poll.
And I am noticing that some of those comments I just referred to went just to us, not to everyone. I should repeat the compliment, but someone mentioned that you couldn't see all of the chat. People have to put to everyone if they want everyone to see it. But a comment about diversity and combination of expertise in the panel was wonderful. And a comment saying, these examples demonstrate the critical importance of having a feedback data loop. It's at the core of being a learning organization that is continually working to improve. Very motivating to hear what these folks learned and did. Eleanor, could you go to the final slide? I just want to share, we've given some resources in the links, but the OPRE website does have the slides, audio recordings and transcripts for our 2 earlier webinars, and will in the future have this one a few months posted after it. And we have a website you can Google, Center for Supporting Research on CCDBG Implementation, to see the slides from the webinars, as well as other resources that I think you'll find useful if you're a CCDF lead agency trying to use data to make policy decisions. And finally, as I just mentioned already, I'm so excited. We are going to be able to continue this webinar series. We'll do 2 more this year. We're partnering with Mathematica on these future webinars aimed at building the capacity of CCDF lead agencies to use data for policy decisions. And everyone who's registered for this, we will send you the flyer with the specific topic and time and all. It's likely to be in June, but won't hold me to that. We will send out that information. Finally, if you have questions or comments on this webinar or webinar series, feel free to email me, Julia Isaacs. I'm at jisaacs@urban.org. And thanks for all your questions. We're exactly at where we meant to be. With final thanks, thank you very much to our presenters. We will sign off until a future webinar.
Thank you.